She was 16 years old, and she smiled, not the nervous, confused smile of a frightened teenager dragged into a courtroom she didn't understand. No, this was a deliberate, slow, conscious smile, aimed directly at the gallery where her mother's sisters sat shaking, clutching tissues like lifeline. The charge was murder, her own mother. And this girl, with her hair neatly braided and her posture relaxed, looked at the proceedings the way someone looks at a boring lecture they're forced to attend. She tilted her head, whispered something to her attorney, and almost laughed. She believed her age was a fortress. She thought the law would see a child and look away, but the judge sitting above her had already seen the footage she swore didn't exist. And when he pressed play, the smile didn't just fade, it shattered. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and tell us what you think below. This is how it all began. Before the courtroom, before the evidence bags and the forensic reports. Before a judge made a decision that would send shockwaves through the legal world, there was a house on Winslow Lane. A quiet house. A house with a flower bed out front that the neighbors always complimented. A house that looked exactly the way safety is supposed to look. Inside that house, a mother named Diane Holloway was raising her daughter, Natalie, alone. Diane worked double shifts at a medical billing office. She packed lunches at 5 in the morning and checked homework at 10 at night. She was tired in the way single mothers understand, a tiredness that lives in the bones and never fully leaves, even during sleep. And Natalie was the center of her world. Every sacrifice Diane made had one direction, her daughter's future. But Diane didn't know that her daughter had already decided the future would not include her. The signs were there, scattered across months like breadcrumbs nobody thought to follow. And by the time anyone looked back, the trail led somewhere no parent should ever have to go. Winslow Lane sat in a suburb called Ridgehaven, about 40 minutes outside a mid-sized American city, the kind of place that appears in real estate listings under words like family-friendly and low crime. The streets curved gently, lined with oak trees old enough to shade entire driveways. Mailboxes stood upright. The lawns were mowed on schedule, and the nearest police station was close enough to feel reassuring, but far enough to feel unnecessary. People moved to Ridgehaven for a specific reason: predictability. The schools scored well, the parks had working lights, and the neighbors said hello without saying too much. It was a place built on the assumption that danger lived somewhere else. Diane Holloway had moved there when Natalie was 6 years old, just after her marriage ended. The divorce was not dramatic, no courtroom battles, no custody wars. Natalie's father, Greg, had simply drifted out of the picture, moving to another state for work, then sending fewer calls, then none. Diane didn't speak badly of him, but she stopped pretending he was coming back. She rebuilt her life with the tools she had: a steady job, a small savings account, and an unshakable commitment to making Natalie feel like she had enough. The house on Winslow Lane was modest: 3 bedrooms, a narrow backyard, a garage that sometimes stuck when it rained. But it was theirs. Diane's coworkers described her the same way: reliable, kind, quiet about her struggles. She was the person who covered shifts without complaint, who remembered birthdays, who left encouraging sticky notes on other people's desks. At home, she kept a routine that held the household together like stitching. Mornings were early, dinners were together when possible, and weekends included errands she tried to make fun, grocery shopping with music in the car, Saturday cleaning with rewards of takeout. She was not a perfect mother because no such thing exists, but she was a present one, which is sometimes the harder thing to be. Natalie, for her part, seemed like a normal child growing up in a normal home. She attended Ridgehaven Middle School and then Ridgehaven High. Teachers noted she was bright, not spectacularly gifted, but sharp enough to do well when she chose to. She had a small circle of friends, participated in a drama club briefly, and kept her grades in the comfortable middle where parents feel relieved but not amazed. Neighbors remembered her as polite when spoken to, quiet when not. She rode her bike as a kid, played in the yard, waved at the mailman. Nothing in those early years set off alarms, but adolescence does not arrive gently for everyone. Around 14, Natalie began pulling away from Diane with a force that felt different from ordinary teenage distance. She stopped joining weekend errands. She started closing her bedroom door with a firmness that sounded like a statement. Her phone became a wall between them, always in her hand, always face down, always locked. Diane noticed, but categorized it as normal. Every parenting article she read said the same thing. Teens need space. Teens push back. Teens are not rejecting you. She believed the articles because the alternative was too frightening to consider. By 15, the distance had edges. Natalie's tone sharpened. Small requests became arguments. Rules, curfews, chores, screen time were met with sighs that carried contempt. Diane tried conversations, tried compromise, tried firmness. Nothing stuck. Natalie had discovered a truth many teenagers stumble upon, but few weaponize, that a single parent living alone with one child has almost no leverage once the child decides not to cooperate. Diane couldn't ground Natalie without being home to enforce it. She couldn't take the phone without a confrontation that left them both drained. The power in the house was shifting, and Diane felt it the way you feel a floor softening. Not sure when it will give way, only that it might. At 16, Natalie crossed into territory Diane couldn't explain away. She stayed out past curfew and offered no explanation. She changed her passwords. She began spending time with people Diane had never met, arriving home in cars she didn't recognize. When Diane asked questions, Natalie responded with a flatness that chilled the room. "I'm fine." "Stop." Two words that carried the weight of a locked gate. Diane confided in a friend that she felt like a stranger in her own house, sharing a roof with someone she no longer recognized. The friend said what friends always say, "It's a phase." But Diane's instinct whispered something else. She just didn't know how to listen to it yet. The last photo Diane posted on social media, 3 weeks before the night that changed everything, showed the kitchen table set for two. A casserole, 2 glasses of water, napkins folded neatly. The caption read, "Tuesday dinner. The small things matter." Natalie was not in the photo. She had refused to eat at the table that night, taking food to her room instead. Diane photographed the empty seats place setting anyway, as if proving to herself that she was still trying. When that image would later circulate in news coverage, not as a happy memory, but as a monument to effort that ran out of time. The table was set for 2. Only 1 chair would ever be used again. Diane kept a journal. Not a diary with locks and daily entries, but a simple notebook she wrote in when worry outpaced her ability to sleep. The entries were scattered, some weeks apart, some clustered in anxious bursts. They were addressed to no one, written in the shorthand of a mother trying to organize fears she couldn't say out loud. One entry from several months before the incident read, "N won't talk to me. Came home at 11. Says she was at a friend's. Which friend? She won't say. I don't know her life anymore." Another 2 weeks later. Found a second phone in her jacket. She said it was a friend's. I don't believe her. But what do I do? The second phone was the detail that later haunted investigators because it confirmed what Diane suspected but could not prove. Natalie was living a parallel life. The device was a cheap prepaid model, the kind sold at convenience stores, the kind that doesn't require parental permission. Diane held it in her hand that night and felt a fear she couldn't name. She wanted to open it, read the messages, understand what her daughter was hiding. But she also feared that crossing that line would sever the last fragile thread between them. She put the phone back. She chose trust over information. It was the kind of choice that keeps mothers awake for years afterward. Diane tried professional help. She called a family counseling center and scheduled an appointment, but Natalie refused to go. Diane went alone twice. was sitting in a waiting room surrounded by brochures about communication and boundaries, feeling like a student who had failed a test she didn't know she was taking. The counselor told her what counselors tell parents of defiant teens: maintain structure, offer consistency, avoid power struggles. Good advice in theory. But theory doesn't account for a daughter who has already decided that the household is the enemy and the mother is the warden. Friends saw the strain. Diane's closest friend, a woman named Rosa who worked in the same office, noticed the dark circles, the missed lunches, the way Diane's phone made her flinch every time it buzzed. Rosa asked directly, "Is Natalie in trouble?" Diane hesitated, then said, "I don't know what she's in." That answer carried a specific kind of helplessness, not ignorance, but the awareness that something was wrong without having a name for it. Rosa offered to talk to Natalie. Diane declined, afraid it would push her daughter further away. In hindsight, further away was already an understatement. At school, teachers noticed a shift too. Natalie's grades didn't collapse, but they dimmed. Assignments came in late or incomplete. Her participation, once moderate, turned to silence. A guidance counselor flagged a pattern: increased absences, detachment, a sharpness in her interactions with authority. The counselor sent a note home. Diane called, left a voicemail, and followed up by email. The counselor suggested an in-school meeting. Natalie attended, sat through it with her arms crossed, agreed to vague commitments, and changed nothing. The system tried. The system was built for averages, not for what was coming. What nobody outside the house knew was that Natalie had developed a fixation, not on rebellion itself, but on the idea of a life without Diane. She spoke about it in whispered conversations with a new circle of online contacts. People she'd met through social platforms and messaging apps. Some were her age, some were older. The conversations varied, but the theme was constant. Natalie described her mother as a prison guard, her home as a cell, and her future as something Diane was stealing. The language was extreme but not unusual for angry teens. What made it different was duration and escalation. Over months, the fantasy of escape hardened into something colder. Resentment that no longer needed a reason, only a target. Diane sensed it without seeing it clearly. In her journal, a later entry read, "She looks at me sometimes like I'm in her way, not angry, just calculating, like she's solving a problem and I'm the variable she wants to remove." Diane underlined "remove" and then crossed it out, as if ashamed of her own thought. She added beneath it, "I'm being dramatic. She's 16. This is what 16 looks like." But it wasn't what 16 looked like. It was what planning looked like, dressed in adolescence and hidden behind a bedroom door that never opened anymore. The house on Winslow Lane still looked the same from outside, trimmed lawn, flower bed, porch light on at dusk. But inside, the air had changed. It carried the weight of conversations that didn't happen, meals eaten in separate rooms, and a silence that had stopped being peaceful and started being loaded. Our Diane kept setting the table for two. Natalie kept eating alone. And somewhere in the digital world Diane couldn't access, her daughter was already describing what would happen next. The flower bed kept blooming. It didn't know what was growing inside. Natalie's second phone was a window into a world Diane never entered. On that device, Natalie was not a sullen teenager struggling with a single mother. She was someone else entirely, confident, sharp, almost charismatic. She used a different name in some conversations. She posted in forums and group chats with the fluency of someone who had been practicing a persona for months. The tone was older than 16, harder than her school demeanor, and built around one central idea, that she was trapped in a life she never chose, and that the only person standing between her and freedom was the woman down the hall. The online contacts varied. Some were strangers she'd never meet. Some were closer, local teens with their own grievances, their own family fractures. Among them was a boy named Tyler Brask, 17, a dropout with a charm that worked on people who were already hurting. Tyler didn't attend school anymore. He worked odd jobs, drove a car with a cracked windshield, and presented himself as someone who understood what adults refused to see. He found Natalie through a mutual contact and recognized something useful in her anger. It was deep, it was focused, and it was looking for permission. Tyler and Natalie's relationship wasn't romantic in the way movies portray teen connection. No dramatic declarations, no constant togetherness. It was transactional, built on shared resentment and a mutual fantasy of escape. Tyler talked about leaving Ridgehaven, about road trips with no destination, about how rules were inventions made by people who were afraid of freedom. Natalie absorbed his language like a sponge and repeated it back with her own modifications. Where Tyler was vague, Natalie was specific. Where he talked about escape, she talked about elimination. "You can't run from a cage if the cage follows you," she wrote once. "You have to dismantle it." Those messages would later be recovered by forensic analysts, reconstructed from cloud backups and device fragments. And they painted a picture that wasn't criminal on any single page, but became devastating when read in sequence. Over weeks, Natalie's language shifted from frustration to fantasy to logistics. She asked Tyler questions that sounded hypothetical until they didn't. If someone needed to do something serious, how would they make sure no one found out? Tyler, either oblivious or indifferent to the implications, responded with the casual cruelty of a teenager who treats real consequences like a video game. "Just don't leave your phone around, and have a story." Natalie's social media presence told a different story from her private messages. Publicly, she posted sparingly. Filtered photos, vague quotes, the occasional selfie with a half smile. Nothing alarming. But her private accounts, accessible only to a curated audience, I showed a darker curation. Posts about feeling invisible, about mothers who consume their children's lives, about wanting to reset everything. One post, shared to a small group 3 weeks before the incident, read, "Some doors only open when you break them." 3 people liked it. None of them told an adult. At home, Natalie's behavior became increasingly strategic. She started being nicer to Diane in small, calculated bursts, complimenting dinner, offering to help with dishes, asking about Diane's day. Diane noticed and felt a swell of relief that embarrassed her afterward. She wrote in her journal, "Maybe we're turning a corner. Anne actually sat at the table tonight. We talked for 20 minutes. Maybe the counselor was right. Consistency works." The entry was hopeful. It was also wrong, because Natalie wasn't reconnecting. She was studying, learning Diane's schedule more precisely, understanding when the house was quietest, when Diane slept deepest, when the neighborhood went still. The week before the incident, Natalie asked Diane a question that seemed innocent. "Mom, do you ever sleep through your alarm?" Diane laughed and said, "Sometimes." "Why?" Natalie shrugged. "Just wondering. You work so hard." Diane smiled at the apparent concern. She didn't write that exchange in her journal, but investigators would later ask about it, and Rosa, the friend, would remember Diane mentioning it in passing, touched by what she thought was empathy. The question wasn't empathy, it was reconnaissance. And Diane's answer, "sometimes," was filed away in a mind that had already started counting down. Tyler visited the neighborhood once. He parked at the end of Winslow Lane and waited while Natalie slipped out through the back door. They sat in his car for 40 minutes, talking. A neighbor saw the car but didn't think much of it. Teenagers do teenager things. When Natalie came back inside, she locked the door behind her and stood in the hallway for a long moment, listening to the house breathe. Diane was asleep. The younger neighbor's lights were off. The street was empty. Natalie went to her room, opened her second phone, and typed 3 words to Tyler. "I'm almost ready." Then she deleted the message and went to bed, or at least lay in the dark with her eyes open, mapping out the hours ahead like rooms in a house she intended to demolish. The secret life was no longer secret from everyone. It was only secret from the one person who needed to know. And the last evening moved with a normalcy that would later feel like cruelty. Diane came home from work at her usual time, heated leftovers, and called Natalie to dinner. Natalie came downstairs, unusual enough to feel like progress. They ate together. Diane talked about a coworker's birthday party. Natalie listened, nodded, even asked a follow-up question. Diane felt the warmth of connection she had been starving for. After dinner, they watched part of a show together. Diane would later be described by friends as someone who cherished those small moments because she knew how rare they had become. She didn't know this was the last one. Around 9:30, Diane yawned, said goodnight, and went to her bedroom. Natalie said, "Night, Mom," with a voice that sounded, for once, almost soft. Diane paused at the hallway and looked back. Natalie was already on her phone, face lit by the screen. Diane thought about saying something more, something meaningful, something that might bridge the gap that months of silence had created. But she was tired, and the moment felt fragile, and she didn't want to break it by trying too hard. She went to bed. The hallway light clicked off. The house settled into its nightly quiet. Outside, the street lamp hummed. The flower bed Diane tended sat still in the dark. Natalie waited. She waited with a patience that didn't belong to impulsiveness. She sat in her room, door closed, second phone in hand, watching the minutes pass. At 11:15, she texted Tyler. "She's asleep." Tyler responded with a single word. "Sure?" Natalie didn't answer. She set the phone down and listened. The house made its sounds. The refrigerator cycling. The settling of walls. The absolute absence of human movement. She had studied this silence for weeks. She knew its rhythms the way a musician knows a song. When she was certain, she stood. What happened next was reconstructed through physical evidence, digital records, and Natalie's own statements. Some given voluntarily, some extracted through investigation. The exact sequence would be debated in court, but certain facts were established beyond dispute. Natalie left her room and moved through the house. She was familiar with every creaking board, every dim corner. She moved not with the stumbling of panic, but with the careful pacing of someone who had rehearsed the route. She reached the kitchen. She selected a heavy object, later identified from trace evidence and consistent with items inventoried in the home. And the details of what followed were documented in clinical terms by medical examiners. But the essence was devastating. Diane Holloway, asleep in her own bed, was attacked with sudden and sustained force. She did not survive. Natalie's actions after the attack revealed the part of the crime that later disturbed prosecutors most: composure. She did not flee. She did not call for help. She did not collapse. She cleaned. Not thoroughly. She was 16, not a forensic expert, but deliberately. She wiped surfaces, moved objects, changed her clothing, and placed the item she had used in a trash bag. She carried the bag outside through the back door, walked to a dumpster behind a nearby strip of commercial buildings, a 7-minute walk she had apparently timed in advance, and disposed of it. Then she walked back, entered the house, and went to her room. She texted Tyler at 1:08 a.m. "It's done." Tyler didn't respond for 14 minutes. When he did, he wrote, "Are you okay?" Natalie replied, "I'm free." She then went to sleep, or at least she lay in her bed until morning, because when her alarm went off at 6:30, she rose, showered, dressed for school, and walked downstairs. She made herself cereal. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she and Diane had eaten dinner hours earlier, and ate breakfast alone. Then, at 7:42 a.m., she called 911. Her voice on the recording was high, breathless, trembling in all the places a voice should tremble. "Something happened to my mom. She's not moving. I think there's something wrong. Please come." Dispatch asked her to check for breathing. Natalie paused, then said, "I can't. I'm too scared." Paramedics were dispatched immediately. When officers arrived, Natalie was standing on the front porch, arms wrapped around herself, tears streaming. She looked exactly like a terrified child who had discovered the unimaginable. She answered early questions with shaking brevity. She woke up, went to check on her mom, found her unresponsive, panicked, called for help. Officers entered the home with care and discovered Diane in the bedroom. The scene was immediately classified as suspicious. The nature of Diane's injuries was inconsistent with natural causes or an accident. Within minutes, the house transformed from a home into a sealed investigation. Yellow tape crossed the door. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk in bathrobes, whispering. And Natalie sat in the back of a patrol car, blanket around her shoulders, watching the house like it belonged to someone else. The delay between the estimated time of Diane's death and Natalie's 911 call was approximately 6 hours. That gap, silent, deliberate, and damning, would become one of the prosecution's most powerful facts. Because innocent people who discover a loved one in distress do not wait until morning. They do not eat breakfast. They do not shower. They call, immediately, desperately. The gap wasn't shock, it was schedule. The morning light hit Winslow Lane the same way it always did, golden, suburban, routine. But inside the house, routine had ended forever. The first detective on scene was a veteran named Claire Mendez, 16 years in homicide, known for patience that other detectives mistook for slowness until it produced results. She walked the house once before touching anything, on letting her eyes adjust to the story the rooms were trying to tell. The front door, locked, no damage. Windows, intact, latches secure. No sign of forced entry anywhere. That fact, the locked, unbroken perimeter, narrowed the field immediately. Whoever harmed Diane Holloway either had a key, was let inside, or never left. Detective Mendez noted it in her first report, with a sentence that would anchor the case. The home was secured from within. The crime scene unit processed the bedroom with painstaking care. Every surface was photographed, swabbed, cataloged. Blood evidence was mapped for spatter patterns and contact traces. The bed, the floor, the walls, each told a fragment of the story. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment indicated blunt force trauma, sustained, deliberate, and delivered while the victim was likely in a prone or resting position. There were no defensive wounds on Diane's hands, which suggested she had not been awake to fight back. That detail was agonizing in its implications. Diane had been asleep, trusting, vulnerable, in the one place every person believes is safe. Neighbors were canvassed within hours. Most reported nothing unusual, no screams, no unfamiliar cars, no broken glass. One neighbor, a retired teacher named Harold Kinney, mentioned seeing Natalie's light on very late the previous night, but he attributed it to teenage habits and thought nothing of it. Another neighbor, 2 doors down, had a doorbell camera. Detectives requested the footage immediately. It showed the street between midnight and 6 a.m. Quiet, empty, undisturbed, except for one moment at approximately 1:15 a.m., when a figure in dark clothing exited the Holloway home's back adjacent path, walked quickly toward the commercial strip, and returned approximately 12 minutes later. The figure was small, slender, and moved with familiarity. No hesitation, no looking around. Natalie was interviewed at the station that afternoon. She was accompanied by a victim advocate, as she was initially treated as a witness and a minor who had lost her mother. Her account was consistent with what she told responding officers. She slept through the night, woke up, found her mother, panicked. She cried during the interview, heavy, shoulder-shaking tears that seemed authentic. When asked if she heard anything, she said no. When asked if Diane had enemies, she shook her head. When asked about her own relationship with her mother, she paused and said, "We had our stuff, but she was my mom." The phrase was careful, not "I loved her," not "she was everything," just "she was my mom," as if stating a fact rather than expressing a feeling. Detective Mendez noticed the word choices. She also noticed the timing. She reviewed the 911 call, cross-referenced it with the medical examiner's preliminary time of death window, and calculated the gap. Then she reviewed the doorbell camera footage and noted the figure's size. Then she requested Natalie's phone records, not aggressively, but as routine in a case where the only other occupant of the home was the person reporting the crime. Natalie's primary phone showed minimal overnight activity. A few notifications, nothing remarkable. But Mendez's instincts flagged something else. The phone felt too clean, too unremarkable for a teenager. The house itself became a witness. Forensic technicians found that certain surfaces in the kitchen and hallway had been wiped, not with the casual tidiness of daily life, but with a deliberateness that left streaks visible under alternate light sources. A towel was missing from the bathroom, not a large towel, but a hand towel that disrupted the visible set. The trash under the kitchen sink had been recently emptied, the bag replaced. Small details. But in homicide investigation, the absence of what should be present speaks as loudly as the presence of what shouldn't. Someone had attempted to curate the scene, to create a version of the house that looked undisturbed. That evening, Detective Mendez sat in her office, eyes staring at the timeline she'd sketched on a legal pad. The gap, the wiped surfaces, the locked house, the camera figure, the clean phone, the careful tears. None of it was proof. All of it was direction. She wrote one word at the bottom of the page, circled it, and set her pen down. The word was Natalie. And from that moment, the investigation had a compass. It pointed inward. The question was no longer who entered the house. The question was who never left. Warrants arrived within days, and analysts began the slow, meticulous extraction of data from every device associated with the Holloway household. Natalie's primary phone yielded little, carefully managed, selectively deleted, the digital equivalent of a made bed. But investigators weren't looking only at what remained. They were looking for what had been removed. Because deletion leaves its own footprint. Metadata, cache files, cloud synchronization records. These digital echoes exist in places most users never think about. When the forensic team pulled cloud backup data, they found a second layer, a device associated with a different number backed up under the same account by mistake. The second phone. The prepaid device's data was partially recoverable. Analysts pieced together message fragments the way archaeologists reconstruct pottery, shard by shard, context by inference. The conversations with Tyler Brask emerged first, not as a complete transcript, but as a narrative skeleton. Enough survived to establish tone, timing, and intent. Messages from weeks before the incident showed Natalie describing her plan in terms that evolved from vague to concrete. Her early messages sounded like venting. "I wish she'd just disappear." Later ones sounded like strategy. "If I do it when she's asleep, she won't make noise." The progression was chilling precisely because it was gradual, not a single explosive decision, but a slow descent marked by escalating specificity. Tyler's role crystallized through these messages. He did not appear to physically participate in the crime, but he functioned as what investigators term an enabler, someone who validates, encourages, and normalizes dangerous thinking without pulling the trigger themselves. His messages didn't say, "Do it." They said things like, "You deserve better," and "No one can stop you but yourself," and "People who control you don't deserve loyalty." Individually, each sentence was vague. Together, they formed a permission structure. Tyler gave Natalie the feeling that her anger was justified, and her plan was rational. Whether that constituted criminal liability would become a separate legal question. But for detectives building the primary case, Tyler's messages served as evidence of Natalie's premeditation. Location data added another layer. Natalie's prepaid phone showed movement on the night of the crime, consistent with the timeline investigators had already built. Activity inside the house during the critical window, a brief period of movement away from the residence, consistent with the camera footage of the figure walking to the commercial strip, and a return. The phone was active, awake, being used. Natalie's claim that she slept through the night was now contradicted not just by one source, but by the convergence of three: camera footage, phone location data, and alarm system absence. The Holloway home didn't have a sophisticated alarm panel, but a smart lock on the back door logged entries. It showed the door opening at 1:09 a.m. and again at 1:22 a.m. Natalie's code. Detectives also recovered a series of Internet searches from the prepaid phone's browser cache, conducted over the 2 weeks before the incident. The searches included queries about cleaning methods, about how long forensic evidence lasts, about what happens to minors charged with serious crimes. One search, dated 4 days before Diane's death, read, "Can a 16-year-old be tried as an adult?" The answer she found apparently wasn't deterrent enough. Another search asked about insurance policies and beneficiaries. Not sophisticated financial planning, but the kind of desperate or shallow research a teenager does when they believe money equals freedom without understanding how the system actually works. Friends were interviewed over subsequent days. Most described Natalie as quiet or moody, words that described half the teenage population and meant little on their own. But 2 friends offered details that mattered. One recalled Natalie saying, approximately a month before the incident, that she wouldn't have to deal with her mom much longer, delivered with a laugh that the friend found uncomfortable but didn't report. Another friend described Natalie practicing facial expressions in a school bathroom, crying on command, switching to neutral, then smiling, and calling it acting practice. At the time, both friends dismissed these moments as teenage oddness. Afterward, they became fragments in a mosaic of premeditation. The digital case was strong, but Detective Mendez wanted more. She wanted physical evidence that tied Natalie directly to the act, something that couldn't be dismissed as someone else used her phone or someone else knew her door code. She sent the forensic team back to the house with a specific request: re-examine the bedroom for trace evidence that might indicate the attacker's identity. What they found would not be dramatic in a cinematic sense, but it would be devastating in a courtroom. A single hair, Natalie's, confirmed by DNA, was found in a location consistent with close proximity to the victim during the attack, combined with a partial shoe impression near the bed matching Natalie's sneaker tread, and the physical evidence corroborated what the digital evidence had already screamed. The chain was nearly complete. Motive documented in messages, opportunity confirmed by location data, method supported by forensic evidence, and consciousness of guilt demonstrated by cleaning, deletion, and delayed reporting. Natalie had tried to erase her tracks, but she had underestimated the persistence of data and the patience of investigators. She deleted messages, but the cloud remembered. She wiped surfaces, but traces remained. She performed grief, but the timeline didn't cry. Every machine in her life had become a witness against her. The arrest of a 16-year-old for the murder of her own mother is not a triumphant moment for anyone. There is no satisfaction in it, only the grim mechanics of a system doing what it was designed to do. Detective Mendez coordinated with Juvenile Services, the District Attorney's Office, and Child Protective Authorities before moving forward. Every step was documented, every protocol observed. The goal was not spectacle. The goal was a case that could survive scrutiny, appeals, and the intense public attention that a case like this inevitably attracts. When the time came, officers approached Natalie at the temporary residence of a family friend where she had been staying since the crime. She opened the door, saw the badges, and said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then she asked, "Is this about my mom?" The officer informed her of the charges calmly, using language appropriate for a minor, with a juvenile advocate already present. Natalie listened. She didn't cry. She didn't protest. She looked at the officer with an expression that several witnesses later described as annoyed, as if being arrested were an interruption to her schedule rather than a consequence of her actions. She asked if she could bring her phone. When told no, her face tightened in a way that communicated more than words. In custody transport, she stared out the window, fidgeting not with anxiety, but with restlessness, the demeanor of someone uncomfortable with boredom, not with guilt. At the juvenile detention facility, Natalie was processed, photographed, and assigned a cell. Staff noted her behavior in intake reports. Cooperative but emotionally flat, responsive to instructions but uninterested in counseling offers, focused on when she could make phone calls and whether she could access the internet. She asked about her legal rights with a specificity that suggested she had researched the topic, which, given her search history, she had. She didn't ask about her mother's funeral arrangements. She didn't ask about flowers or services or who was handling the house. She asked about her case, only her case. Tyler Brask was picked up the same day, questioned, and initially held as a material witness. His device had been seized under warrant, and its contents were being analyzed alongside Natalie's. Tyler's initial posture was defensive. He denied involvement, denied knowledge, denied being near the Holloway home. But his messages contradicted his words, and when confronted with specific texts, "If it's what you need to do, I get it." His demeanor shifted from denial to self-preservation. He asked for a lawyer. He stopped talking. His silence, paradoxically, confirmed to investigators that he knew exactly what he had encouraged. The question of charging Tyler as an accessory or co-conspirator would follow its own legal path, but his role in Natalie's psychological preparation was already clear. The community's reaction was split along a fault line that true crime cases always expose, the line between accountability and compassion. Some neighbors expressed shock that Natalie could do such a thing. "She seemed so normal" became the refrain that echoed through local news interviews. Others, particularly those who had known Diane personally, expressed a colder, harder grief. The grief of betrayal, of realizing that the danger wasn't a stranger, but a daughter. Rosa, Diane's closest friend, gave one brief statement to reporters that became the emotional anchor of early coverage. "Diane spent every day trying to keep that girl safe, and that girl spent every night planning to end her." Inside the legal system, the case moved with deliberate speed. The district attorney announced the charges publicly, 1 count of first-degree murder with aggravating factors including premeditation, domestic relationship, and vulnerability of the victim. The DA also announced the state's intention to seek transfer to adult court, a decision that reignited the perennial debate about juvenile justice. Advocates for juvenile rehabilitation argued that a 16-year-old's brain is not fully developed, that the capacity for change is real, that adult sentencing would constitute abandonment disguised as justice. Prosecutors countered with the evidence of planning, concealment, and post-crime composure, arguing that the sophistication of the crime demanded an adult response. Natalie's court-appointed attorney, a seasoned juvenile defense lawyer named Sandra Levine, began building a narrative that would frame the case for the defense. A troubled teenager, an absent father, a controlling home environment, manipulation by an older male, and a mental health history that had never been properly addressed. It was a narrative that contained elements of truth. Natalie's life was not easy, her father was absent, her mental health was undersupported. But the prosecution would argue that hardship explains behavior without excusing it, and that explanation is not the same as absolution. In the detention facility that night, a staff member passed Natalie's cell during a routine check and observed her sitting cross-legged on the bed, writing in a notebook she'd been given for journaling. The staff member noted that Natalie was not crying, not pacing, not exhibiting distress. She was writing quickly with focus, like a student preparing for an exam. When asked later by a counselor what she had written, Natalie smiled thinly and said, "My side of the story." The notebook would eventually be reviewed under legal process. What it contained was not remorse. It was strategy, notes about what to say, and more importantly, what not to. She was 16 years old, in a cell, charged with killing the one person who had never stopped trying to save her. And her primary concern was controlling the narrative. But the hearing to determine whether Natalie Holloway would be tried as an adult or remain in the juvenile system drew attention far beyond Ridgehaven. Courtroom seats were allocated by lottery. Press credentials were reviewed and limited. The hallway outside the courtroom hummed with low conversations. Legal analysts, victim advocates, and community members who had come not for spectacle, but for a question that felt deeply personal. When a child commits an act this deliberate, what does the law owe the child, and what does it owe the dead? Judge William Trent presided. He was 61, appointed to the bench nearly 20 years earlier, known for measured rulings and a refusal to be theatrical. He had handled juvenile transfer cases before, but none with this combination of age, victim relationship, and premeditation evidence. He opened the hearing with a statement that set the room's temperature. This court will evaluate the factors required by statute. It will not be influenced by public sentiment, media coverage, or the desire for retribution. The question before me is narrow. Does the nature of the offense and the characteristics of the respondent warrant adult jurisdiction? The prosecution presented evidence of premeditation with the precision of a watchmaker. They walked through the digital trail, searches, messages, location data, without sensationalism, letting the facts carry their own emotional weight. They described the crime scene: locked house, no forced entry, wiped surfaces, missing item disposed of off-site. They introduced Natalie's post-crime behavior, the delayed call, the performance of grief, and the careful tears as evidence of sophistication. The prosecutor, a woman named Adrienne Cole, spoke without raising her voice. She didn't need to. She ended with a question aimed at the judge's sense of proportion. When the evidence shows an offender who planned, executed, concealed, and performed, at what point does chronological age become irrelevant to the question of accountability? Defense attorney Sandra Levine countered with the tools the juvenile system was built to use: developmental psychology, brain science, and the possibility of change. She brought a psychologist who testified that the adolescent prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until the mid-20s. That impulse control, risk assessment, and empathy regulation are biologically incomplete in teenagers. The testimony was accurate as general science, and the prosecution would later argue that it was irrelevant to specific facts because the crime wasn't impulsive. It was planned over weeks. Brain development explains poor decisions made in moments. It struggles to explain deliberate action sustained across days. Levine also introduced Maya's personal history: the absent father, the emotional isolation, the unaddressed mental health concerns, and the influence of Tyler Brask. She framed Tyler as a predatory older figure who exploited Natalie's vulnerability and radicalized her anger into action. It was an argument designed to shift moral weight, to make the court see Natalie not as the origin of violence, but as its product. The argument was not without merit. Tyler did contribute to Natalie's escalation. The question was whether contribution equaled causation, and whether understanding the why should change the where of prosecution. Natalie appeared in court in clean, simple clothing, a deliberate choice by defense to emphasize her youth. She sat quietly, head slightly bowed, hands folded. It was the most subdued the gallery had seen her, and veteran court watchers noted the contrast with her earlier demeanor. She didn't smile. She didn't roll her eyes. She looked for the first time like a scared kid. Whether it was genuine or performed was the question everyone in the room silently asked, and no one could definitively answer. The judge watched her the way he watched every respondent, with the careful attention of someone who knows that appearances are evidence of effort, not necessarily of truth. Judge Trent took 2 days to issue his ruling. When he returned to the bench, the courtroom was so quiet that the air conditioning became audible. He acknowledged the defense's points about youth, development, and trauma. He acknowledged the prosecution's evidence of planning and post-crime behavior. Then he delivered the key passage that would be quoted in every subsequent article about the case. The juvenile system exists to rehabilitate children who make terrible mistakes. But when the evidence demonstrates sustained deliberation, strategic concealment, and manipulative post-offense behavior, this court must ask whether the juvenile framework possesses the capacity to address both the public safety concern and the severity of the offense. In this case, after careful review, the court finds that it does not. Transfer granted. Natalie's face didn't crumble. It hardened. Her jaw set. Her eyes narrowed. And for a fraction of a moment, the careful performance dropped and something raw surfaced. Not fear, but fury. Fury at losing control. Fury at a system that didn't bend the way she expected. Sandra Levine placed a hand on her arm. Natalie shrugged it off. As she was led from the courtroom, she looked once at the gallery, not at Diane's family, but past them, as if searching for someone who wasn't there. Tyler, perhaps. Or her father. Or the version of herself that still believed consequences were optional. Outside, the debate continued in the parking lot, on social media, in opinion columns and podcast episodes that would follow for months. But inside the system, the gears had shifted. Natalie Holloway would face an adult trial for the murder of her mother. The stakes had changed. The sentences had changed. And the girl who thought her age was a shield was about to learn that shields only work when the court agrees to recognize them. The gavel's echo followed her down the hallway. She didn't look back. In the weeks between the transfer ruling and the trial's opening, both sides built their cases with the understanding that this courtroom would be watched, not just by the 12 jurors who would decide Natalie's fate, but by a public that had already formed opinions and was hungry for confirmation. Prosecutor Adrienne Cole assembled a case that was deliberately restrained in tone and overwhelming in substance. She didn't need emotion from the evidence. The evidence was emotional enough on its own. She organized witnesses in a sequence designed to build a narrative wall, brick by brick, where each piece of testimony sealed the one before it and supported the one after. Sandra Levine, meanwhile, refined the defense strategy. She could not reasonably deny that Natalie was in the house that night, or that the digital evidence was authentic. Instead, she would challenge the interpretation. Yes, Natalie sent those messages. But teenagers say extreme things they don't mean. Yes, Natalie searched for those terms. But curiosity is not intent. Yes, Natalie cleaned the scene, but a frightened child might try to fix things without understanding what they're doing. The defense would ask the jury to view every piece of evidence through the lens of a 16-year-old brain, not an adult one. It was a difficult argument, but it was the best argument available. Expert witnesses were lined up on both sides. The prosecution's forensic analyst would walk the jury through device recovery and location mapping. Their crime scene specialist would explain what the physical evidence indicated about proximity, timing, and sequence. The medical examiner would testify about Diane's injuries with clinical precision, establishing that the attack was not a single impulsive act, but a sustained application of force. Each expert was chosen not only for their credentials, but for their ability to communicate clearly to non-specialists, because juries don't convict on complexity. They convict on comprehension. The defense retained a developmental psychologist to testify about adolescent brain function, an expert on coercive relationships to contextualize Tyler's influence, and a social worker to describe the systemic failures that left Natalie without adequate mental health support. These witnesses would not argue innocence. They would argue diminished culpability, the legal equivalent of saying, "She did it, but she is not entirely the person who should be held responsible." It was a nuanced position, and nuance is always harder to sell than clarity. The prosecution's story was simple. She planned it, she did it, she hid it. The defense's story required the jury to hold multiple truths at once. Natalie herself was prepared for the possibility of testifying, though Levine was cautious about putting her on the stand. Natalie's verbal intelligence was a double-edged weapon. She could articulate well enough to be sympathetic, but she could also reveal the strategic coldness that had defined her behavior since the arrest. In mock sessions, Levine noticed that Natalie couldn't sustain emotional vulnerability for more than a few minutes before her tone shifted toward irritation or dismissiveness. That shift would be lethal in front of a jury. The decision on whether she would testify remained open, a strategic card held close. Jury selection was its own battleground. Both sides sought jurors who could be fair, but fairness is defined differently depending on which table you sit at. The prosecution wanted jurors who valued evidence and structure, people who would follow the timeline and trust the forensics. The defense wanted jurors with empathy for children, experience with difficult family dynamics, and skepticism toward the idea that teenagers are fully formed. The final panel of 12 was a cross-section of the community: parents, professionals, a retired teacher, a small business owner. They carried their own experiences into the jury box, and those experiences would filter every word they heard. In the days before opening statements, Natalie was observed by facility staff exhibiting a noticeable behavioral shift. She became quieter, more compliant, almost subdued. She asked about courtroom procedures with what seemed like genuine anxiety. Cynical observers noted that this shift coincided with coaching sessions with her defense team. More generous observers suggested that the reality of an adult trial was finally penetrating the armor she had worn since arrest. The truth may have been both. Teenagers are capable of genuine fear and strategic adaptation simultaneously. The question the trial would ultimately answer was which impulse ran deeper. The night before opening statements, Rosa, Diane's friend, sat in her car outside the courthouse and stared at the building for 20 minutes without going in. She had agreed to testify during the victim impact phase, but dreaded the moment she would have to look at Natalie and speak about the woman Natalie had taken from the world. Rosa had brought a photo of Diane, the same kitchen table image from social media, the one with 2 place settings and 1 empty chair. She pressed it against the steering wheel and whispered something no reporter heard. Then she wiped her eyes, started the engine, and drove home to prepare for tomorrow. The courtroom was set. The players were positioned, and somewhere in a holding area, Natalie Holloway was brushing her hair for the jury, practicing, as always, the face she wanted them to see. Opening day began with the weight of inevitability. Jurors took their seats with the careful posture of people who understood they were about to carry something they hadn't asked for. The gallery was full, but quiet, not the electric buzz of entertainment, but the heavy stillness of people confronting something real. Natalie entered from a side door, escorted, dressed in a soft blue blouse that Levine had chosen for its association with youth and innocence. She walked to the defense table without looking at anyone, sat down, and placed her hands flat on the surface, a gesture of composure that looked practiced because it was. Prosecutor Adrienne Cole stood, unbuttoned her jacket, and opened without preamble. Diane Holloway went to sleep in her own bed, in her own home, on a Tuesday night, she began. She did not wake up. She was not killed by a stranger. She was not killed by an intruder who broke in through a window or forced a lock. She was killed by the person she trusted most in the world, Her daughter, Natalie Holloway, who planned the attack over weeks, carried it out while her mother slept, concealed the evidence, and called 911 only when the performance of grief was ready. Cole paused, letting the sentence settle. Then she added, "This case is not complicated. It is just unbearable." The prosecution's first witness was the responding officer who arrived at the Holloway home on the morning of the 911 call. He described the scene with professional restraint. The locked front door and the absence of forced entry, the condition of the bedroom, and Natalie's demeanor. Under questioning, he noted that Natalie's tears appeared to stop when she believed no one was watching, a detail he documented in his report. He also noted the home's condition, surfaces in the kitchen and hallway that appeared recently wiped, a bathroom missing a towel from an otherwise complete set, and a trash can with a freshly replaced bag. "It didn't look ransacked," he testified. "It looked managed." Crime scene technicians followed, presenting photographs and diagrams that mapped the physical evidence. The jury saw the bedroom without graphic imagery. The prosecution had made a deliberate choice to focus on evidence markers, spatial relationships, and forensic indicators rather than shock. And a blood pattern analyst testified about the nature of the attack. The injuries were consistent with a sustained assault using a heavy blunt instrument, delivered from a position consistent with the attacker standing beside the bed. There was no evidence the victim had risen or attempted to flee, which indicated she was unconscious or incapacitated from the initial impact. The analyst's clinical tone made the content more powerful, not less, because it forced the jury to process facts without the buffer of emotion. The medical examiner testified next. She confirmed the cause and manner of death and established the time window, late night to early morning, that aligned with the digital and physical evidence. Under cross-examination, Levine pressed on the precision of time-of-death estimates, noting they involved ranges, not exact moments. The examiner conceded the inherent uncertainty, but emphasized that the range was narrow and consistent with the prosecution's timeline. Levine's point was valid in isolation. In context, it was a small stone trying to redirect a river. The doorbell camera footage was played for the jury without narration. The courtroom watched a grainy but clear image. A small figure in dark clothing exiting the path beside the Holloway home at approximately 1:15 a.m., walking with purpose toward the commercial strip and returning roughly 12 minutes later. The figure's size, gait, and clothing were consistent with Natalie. No face was visible, but the prosecution didn't need a face. They needed pattern consistency, and they had it. The jury watched the footage twice. The second viewing was quieter than the first, which meant it had landed. Digital forensics testimony consumed the rest of the day. The analyst walked the jury through the recovery of messages from the prepaid phone, the location data showing movement within the house during the critical window, and the smart lock records showing the back door's code-authenticated openings. The "It's done" message was read into the record. A juror in the second row closed her eyes briefly when she heard it. The analyst also presented the Internet search history, queries about evidence, about juvenile law, about cleaning, arranged chronologically to show an arc from curiosity to preparation. The defense objected to characterization. The judge allowed the data but instructed the jury to draw their own conclusions about intent. By the end of the prosecution's opening days, the case felt less like an argument and more like an accounting. Every piece of evidence had been laid before the jury with the patience of someone assembling a machine, each component meaningless alone, each essential to the whole. Natalie sat through it with decreasing composure. By afternoon, her careful poise had developed cracks, a jaw clench during the camera footage, a barely perceptible headshake during the digital testimony, and one moment when she leaned toward Levine and whispered something that made the attorney stiffen and shake her head. The jury saw it. They saw everything, and they hadn't heard the defense yet. The prosecution rested as if setting down a completed structure. The silence that followed felt like the moment before a verdict, not the real one, but the emotional one. Because by now, the question wasn't whether the evidence was compelling. The question was whether anything could make the jury unsee it. Sandra Levine opened the defense's case with an appeal to complexity. "You've heard a story told in straight lines," she said to the jury. "Evidence presented as a chain with no missing links. But human beings are not chains. They are tangled, broken, unfinished things, especially at 16. She described Natalie's life without excusing the crime. The absent father, the emotional isolation, the unaddressed mental health struggles, the manipulative influence of Tyler Brask. She asked the jury to hold two truths simultaneously: that something terrible happened, and that the person responsible was herself a product of terrible circumstances. "Understanding is not the same as forgiveness," she said, "but it is the foundation of just sentencing." The defense's developmental psychologist testified about the adolescent brain with the authority of decades of research. She explained that the prefrontal cortex, responsible for judgment, impulse control, and consequence evaluation, continues developing until approximately age 25. She described how teenagers are more susceptible to external influence, more reactive to perceived threats, and less capable of fully understanding the permanence of their actions. Under cross-examination, Cole asked a pointed question: "Does adolescent brain development explain a crime planned over multiple weeks, involving internet research, evidence concealment, and a delayed 911 call?" The psychologist paused, then answered carefully: "Development explains vulnerability to poor decision-making. It does not explain every specific action." Cole thanked her. The admission hung in the air. An expert on coercive relationships testified about Tyler's influence, describing how older individuals can exploit younger, emotionally vulnerable targets by providing validation, encouraging grievances, and normalizing extreme thinking. The testimony was compelling as a framework, but when Cole cross-examined and asked whether the expert had reviewed the messages in which Natalie was the initiator, messages where she described her plans before Tyler encouraged them, the expert acknowledged that the dynamic was bidirectional. Natalie wasn't simply led. She was also leading. The coercion narrative didn't collapse, but it buckled. The moment the courtroom had been waiting for arrived when Levine announced that Natalie would testify. And the decision was a gamble. The jury needed to see a human being, not a case file. But putting Natalie on the stand meant exposing her to cross-examination, and to herself. She took the oath, sat in the witness chair, and looked at the jury with wide, damp eyes. Under Levine's gentle questioning, she described her loneliness, her anger at her father's absence, her feeling that Diane's rules were suffocating. She cried when talking about the night itself, describing it in fragmented emotional bursts. "I don't know why I did it," she said. "I just wanted it to stop. Everything." For approximately 20 minutes, the defense's strategy seemed to be working. The jury saw a crying teenager, small in the witness chair, speaking about pain and confusion. Several jurors softened visibly. A woman in the front row uncrossed her arms. The gallery leaned forward with something that resembled the beginning of empathy. Natalie was performing the role of a damaged child, and she was performing it well, better than any of her previous attempts, because this time the stakes were her entire future. Then Adrienne Cole stood for cross-examination, and the atmosphere shifted like a change in air pressure. Cole didn't attack. She didn't raise her voice. She simply asked questions that required Natalie to reconcile her tears with her actions. "You said you don't know why you did it, but you searched online for how to conceal evidence 2 weeks before. Can you explain that search?" Natalie's mouth opened, then closed. She looked at Levine. Levine couldn't help her. "I was just curious," Natalie said. Cole nodded, then moved to the next question. "You texted Tyler at 1:08 a.m. and said, 'It's done.' What was done? Natalie's composure flickered. I don't remember sending that. Cole produced the exhibit. Natalie stared at it and said nothing for 6 seconds. A courtroom eternity. The cross-examination continued for over an hour, and with each question, Natalie's performance eroded. She contradicted her earlier statements. She claimed not to remember messages she had sent. She grew visibly irritated when pressed on the timeline, at one point saying, "I already answered that," with a sharpness that cut through her earlier tears. The jury watched the transformation from weeping child to annoyed defendant in the span of 60 minutes. It was not a dramatic collapse. It was worse, a slow reveal, like watching someone peel off a mask one layer at a time without realizing they were doing it. When Natalie stepped down from the stand, the courtroom was quiet in a way that suggested the emotional calculus had shifted. The defense had gambled on the jury seeing a child. The jury may have seen a child, but they also saw a child who could cry on command, forget on command, and sharpen on command. And in a case built on the argument that this teenager was sophisticated enough to plan a murder, her sophistication on the stand became the prosecution's final, unintended exhibit. Levine rested the defense. The air in the courtroom felt thinner, as if the room itself knew the closing arguments were next. Prosecutor Adrienne Cole stood for the last time before the jury and spoke without notes. She had internalized the case so thoroughly that the evidence moved through her like a current. "This is a case about choices," she began. "So not one choice, a series of choices made over weeks, each one bringing us closer to the night Diane Holloway was killed in her sleep by the person she gave everything to." She walked the jury through the chain again, not as repetition, but as architecture. The messages showing escalation, the searches showing preparation, the alarm code and smart lock showing access, the camera footage showing movement, the forensic evidence showing proximity, the delayed call showing concealment, and the testimony showing a defendant who could not sustain honesty for more than 20 minutes under oath. Cole's most powerful moment came when she addressed the defense's central argument: youth. "I do not dispute that Natalie Holloway is 16, she said. "I do not dispute that the adolescent brain is developing. But development is not a magic word that erases deliberation. This defendant didn't act in a flash of rage. She researched, she messaged, she waited, she executed, she cleaned, she disposed, she waited again, she showered, she ate breakfast, she called 911 when she was ready." Cole let each verb land. That is not impulsivity. That is not a developing brain failing to appreciate consequences. That is someone who understood consequences perfectly and believed she could avoid them. She ended with Diane, not with evidence or legal argument, but with the person at the center of the case. Diane Holloway was a mother who set the table for two even when her daughter wouldn't sit down. She kept a notebook of counseling resources she never got to use. She went to bed that night believing tomorrow would be another chance to reach her child. She did not get tomorrow. Natalie Holloway took it from her. And the evidence, not emotion, not anger, not revenge, the evidence proves it beyond any reasonable doubt. Sandra Levine's closing was the harder task. She could not erase the evidence. She could not make the jury forget the timeline. What she could do was plant a seed of doubt about the certainty with which the prosecution connected each dot. She emphasized the grainy camera footage. "You cannot see a face." She pointed to the messages. "Teenagers say terrible things they don't act on every day." She questioned the shoe impression. "A common brand worn by millions." And she returned again to the brain, to the idea that a 16-year-old making devastating choices is still, fundamentally, a child whose capacity for understanding and control is incomplete. Levine also addressed the elephant in the courtroom, Natalie's testimony. She acknowledged that her client had not been a perfect witness. She is terrified, she is confused, and she is 16. She asked the jury not to confuse poor testimony with guilt, not to equate nervousness with deception, not to punish a child for failing to perform grief on a schedule that satisfied adults. It was a skilled argument, designed to create just enough hesitation, because hesitation is where reasonable doubt lives. But even Levine's voice carried a note of effort, as if she were pushing a boulder uphill and could feel gravity winning. Judge Trent delivered his instructions with the careful neutrality the law requires. He defined reasonable doubt, explained the elements of first-degree murder the prosecution was required to prove, and reminded the jury that sympathy, for any party, was not a legal standard. "You must decide this case on the evidence presented in this courtroom," he said, "not on what you read, heard, or felt before you entered it." The jury filed out. The door closed. The waiting began. The deliberation lasted 2.5 days. It was a length that made both sides nervous, long enough to suggest disagreement, short enough to suggest resolution. During those days, the courthouse hallway became a slow-motion vigil. Diane's family sat on benches, barely eating, barely speaking, held together by the shared gravity of waiting. Natalie's court-appointed guardian sat on the opposite side, reviewing paperwork, occasionally glancing at the closed jury room door as if willing it to open or stay shut. Reporters paced and checked phones. On the cafeteria served coffee that no one tasted. Natalie waited in a holding area, separated from the tension, but not from the fear. Staff reported that she had stopped asking strategic questions. She had stopped performing. She sat and stared at the wall with an expression that might have been exhaustion, or might have been the first authentic emotion she had shown since arrest. The dawning comprehension that the story she had written for herself was about to be edited by 12 strangers. For the first time, Natalie Holloway was not in control of the narrative, and the absence of control, for someone who had built her identity around it, was its own kind of sentence. When the jury sent word that a verdict had been reached, the courtroom filled in minutes. People stood until the judge entered, then sat in unison, on the collective motion carrying the weight of a held breath. The foreperson, a middle-aged man with a lined face and steady hands, stood when asked if the jury had reached a unanimous verdict. He said yes. The clerk read the charge. The foreperson delivered the word that would define the rest of Natalie Holloway's life. Guilty. First-degree murder. Unanimous. The sound that followed was not a gasp. It was a collective exhale, the room releasing something it had been holding for weeks. Diane's sister lowered her head and pressed both hands against her face. Rosa closed her eyes. The retired teacher on the jury blinked rapidly. Natalie's face went blank, not the rehearsed blankness of performance, but the genuine emptiness of someone absorbing a reality they had spent months refusing to imagine. Her mouth opened slightly. No sound came out. For the first time in the entire case, Natalie Holloway had nothing to say. The smirk was gone. In its place was something smaller and more honest, the look of someone who had finally run out of faces to wear. Between verdict and sentencing, the case entered its most human phase, the period where evidence steps back and impact steps forward. Prosecutor Cole prepared victim impact statements, coordinated with Diane's family, and assembled a sentencing memorandum that documented not just the crime's facts, but its ripple effects. A mother erased, a family broken, a community fractured, a neighborhood that would never again assume safety was default. The prosecution sought the maximum sentence available under state law for a juvenile tried as an adult, arguing that the premeditated nature of the crime, the vulnerability of the sleeping victim, and the defendant's sustained post-crime deception warranted the harshest response the system could deliver. Defense attorney Levine prepared mitigation materials with equal intensity. She compiled evaluations from psychologists, social workers, and educators who had assessed Natalie in custody. Their findings painted a portrait of a teenager with undiagnosed attachment issues, borderline personality traits in development, and a history of emotional neglect by a father whose absence created a wound Diane alone could not heal. The evaluations did not excuse the murder. They contextualized it, arguing that Natalie's psychological makeup, combined with Tyler's influence and the absence of adequate intervention, produced a catastrophe that might have been prevented if the system had caught the warning signs earlier. Natalie herself underwent a court-ordered comprehensive psychological evaluation that took days to complete. The evaluator noted that Natalie displayed limited genuine remorse, a finding that carried weight at sentencing. When asked about her mother, Natalie could describe the event but struggled to connect it to emotional loss. She spoke about Diane's death the way someone describes a problem that spiraled out of control. Regret for the complication, not grief for the person. The evaluator wrote, "The defendant demonstrates an understanding that her actions were wrong in a legal sense, but shows limited evidence of empathic comprehension of the victim's suffering or the broader human cost." In custody, Natalie's behavior had shifted during the trial's final weeks. The strategic sharpness gave way to something quieter, not remorse exactly, but a withdrawal that staff interpreted as either depression or the collapse of the psychological structures she had relied on. She stopped asking about legal strategy. She stopped writing in her notebook. She sat in common areas without engaging, staring at nothing in particular. A counselor who spoke with her described the conversation as like talking to someone who has lost their map, aware she was somewhere unfamiliar, unable to pretend she knew the way out. Tyler Brask, charged separately as an accessory, had by this point entered a plea agreement that required his testimony in Natalie's case and imposed a significant sentence of his own. His cooperation confirmed details about the messaging timeline and the nature of his encouragement. But his testimony also revealed a portrait of Natalie that complicated the defense's manipulated child narrative. Tyler described Natalie as the one with the ideas and himself as going along. Whether that was truth or self-protection, it added to the weight the judge would carry into sentencing. The community prepared for closure it knew might never feel complete. Diane's co-workers organized a memorial fund. Her neighbors planted a garden on the strip of grass where Diane's flower bed had been. Rosa collected messages from people who had known Diane and assembled them into a booklet she planned to read from during impact statements. The booklet was not long. It didn't need to be, and the shortest entries carried the most weight. She always asked how my kids were. She never forgot a birthday. She made me feel like I wasn't invisible. Each sentence was a small proof of a life that mattered, the kind of proof that no court exhibit can replicate. Sentencing day was set. The courtroom would fill one more time. The judge would speak. Natalie would have the opportunity to address the court. And the system, imperfect, slow, and deeply human, would assign a number to something that numbers can never fully capture. The question was not whether Natalie would be punished. The question was what the punishment would mean. To her, to Diane's memory, and to every person who would walk out of that courtroom carrying the weight of what they heard. The calendar turned, the date arrived. And the final chapter of the case prepared to write itself in the language courts have used for centuries. In sentences measured not in words, but in years. Sentencing day opened under gray skies that seemed to press down on the courthouse like a hand. The gallery filled early with people who had earned their seats through grief. Diane's family, her co-workers, her neighbors, the friends who had watched her struggle and admired her persistence. Framed photographs lined the front rail. Diane at a work picnic, laughing. Diane and Natalie at a younger age. Natalie on her mother's lap, both of them smiling with the uncomplicated joy that only exists before things break. The photos were not entered as evidence. They were entered as presence, proof that the person at the center of this case was not a case at all, but a life. Rosa spoke first. She stood at the podium with the booklet she had assembled, her hands trembling, but her voice deliberate. She began by describing the Diane she knew, not the victim, but the person. The woman who texted back immediately. The woman who noticed when someone else was quiet. The woman who drove across town to bring soup to a sick friend and stayed to do the dishes. Rosa's words were simple because Diane's kindness was simple, the kind that doesn't announce itself but is felt like sunlight through a window. When Rosa described the morning she learned what had happened, her voice cracked but held. "I called her phone," Rosa said. "It rang and rang, and I knew. Before anyone told me, I knew, because Diane always answered." Diane's sister, Margaret, spoke next with a different kind of grief, the grief of family, of shared blood, of someone who remembered Diane as a child before she was a mother. Margaret described growing up with Diane, their shared bedrooms and whispered conversations, the way Diane always took care of everyone else before herself. "She raised that girl with everything she had," Margaret said, looking not at Natalie but at the jury box, as if appealing to the memory of the trial. "She worked herself to the bone. She skipped meals so Natalie wouldn't. She went to counseling alone because her daughter wouldn't go. And this is what she got." Margaret's composure fractured on the last word, and she pressed a hand to her chest as if holding something in. The courtroom didn't move. A neighbor, Harold Kinney, the retired teacher who had noticed Natalie's light on late, spoke briefly and with visible reluctance. He described the community's loss in practical terms: the empty driveway, the untended flower bed, the house now sold to strangers who didn't know its history. "Diane made this street better," he said. "Not in any dramatic way. She just cared. She waved. She brought cookies at Christmas. She kept her yard nice because she thought it mattered. And it did matter. It mattered because it meant someone was paying attention." He sat down quickly, as if staying longer would cost more than he could afford. The prosecution's sentencing memorandum was read into the record with the precision of a document designed to survive appeal. It cataloged the premeditation evidence, the post-crime behavior, the psychological evaluation's finding of limited remorse, and the irreplaceable nature of the loss. It cited sentencing guidelines in prior cases involving juvenile defendants tried as adults, arguing that the court's responsibility was not only to the defendant, but to the community's trust that serious crimes produce serious consequences. The memorandum closed with a sentence that carried the weight of the entire case. "Diane Holloway cannot speak for herself. The evidence speaks for her, and the evidence asks this court for accountability." Defense attorney Levine presented mitigation with the urgency of someone who knew the tide was against her but believed the effort mattered regardless. She described Natalie's childhood abandonment, the mental health gaps, the influence of Tyler, and the potential for change that still existed in a 16-year-old mind. But she asked the judge to impose a sentence that reflected both the gravity of the crime and the possibility of redemption. A lengthy term with eventual parole eligibility, not a sentence designed to end all hope. "If we sentence children as though they can never change," Levine argued, "we become a society that has given up on its own future." Through it all, Natalie sat at the defense table with an expression that had been scrubbed of its earlier performances. She did not smile, she did not smirk, she did not cry dramatically or stare defiantly. She looked small and tired, and, perhaps for the first time, genuinely present in the reality of what she had done. Whether that presence was remorse or simply the exhaustion of running out of masks, the courtroom could not be certain. But it was different from everything that had come before. The girl who had smiled after killing her mother was no longer smiling. The courtroom noticed, and the courtroom waited. Diane's photos watched from the rail. The flowers in them were still blooming. Judge William Trent took the bench for the final time in this case with the deliberate calm of a man who had weighed something heavy and found his footing. The courtroom was full, breathing shallow, as if even the air understood that what came next would be permanent. Natalie stood when instructed. She was asked if she wished to address the court before sentencing. Levine had prepared a statement with her. Natalie held the paper, looked at it, and then set it down. She chose to speak without it. "I know what I did was wrong," she said. Her voice was quiet, smaller than it had been at any point in the proceedings. "I think about my mom. I think about that night. I don't know how to explain why I did it. I was angry, and I thought things would be better." She paused. The courtroom waited for the word. "Sorry." It came, but it landed unevenly. "I'm sorry for what happened. Not, I'm sorry I killed my mother. Not, I'm sorry I took her life." The passive construction, "what happened," was noticed by everyone trained to listen for it: the judge, the prosecutor, the gallery. It was the language of someone acknowledging an event, not accepting authorship. And in a courtroom built to measure accountability, the distinction mattered. Judge Trent listened without expression. When Natalie finished and sat down, he paused for a long moment, not for drama, but for the weight of what he was about to say. Then he began, and he acknowledged the tragedy in its fullest scope. A mother who devoted herself to raising a daughter alone, a daughter whose unaddressed pain and unchecked anger escalated into irreversible violence, a community that lost one of its most quietly essential members. He acknowledged the defense's arguments about youth, brain development, and the possibility of rehabilitation. He did not dismiss them. He incorporated them into his reasoning, and then he explained why they were insufficient. "The evidence in this case establishes not a moment of impulse, but a campaign of deliberation," Judge Trent said. The defendant researched methods of concealment. She exchanged messages describing her intentions. She waited for the optimal moment. She carried out the act while her mother slept, a state of absolute trust and vulnerability. She then cleaned the scene, disposed of evidence, delayed reporting by hours, and performed grief for first responders and investigators. Each of these actions represents a separate, conscious decision. He paused. Youth explains many things. It explains emotional volatility, susceptibility to influence, and limited foresight. But when a pattern of choices extends over weeks and survives multiple opportunities for reflection, the court must ask what youth does not explain. In this case, youth does not explain the sustained, strategic nature of the defendant's conduct. The judge then turned to the legal framework. He cited the state sentencing provisions for juveniles tried as adults, the constitutional limits on juvenile punishment established by precedent, and the requirement that any sentence account for the defendant's age and the possibility of maturation. He noted that he was constrained, and that the constraints themselves reflected a society trying to balance justice with hope. Then he delivered the sentence that would generate headlines, legal commentary, and a debate that would outlast every person in that room: life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 35 years. The sentence was consecutive, reflecting the court's finding that each element of the crime, the planning, the act, the concealment, warranted separate weight. Natalie would be eligible for parole review at approximately age 51, at which point a board would evaluate whether she had demonstrated genuine rehabilitation. The number landed in the courtroom like a stone in still water, or 35 years before even the possibility of freedom. Not a life sentence without hope? The judge had explicitly rejected that option for a juvenile. But a sentence long enough to communicate that the system does not regard the premeditated taking of a mother's life as a childhood mistake. Levine's hand found Natalie's arm. Natalie did not react. She stared forward, her face pale, her lips slightly parted, as if the number were still traveling through her, finding every room she had built inside herself and filling it with a duration she had never truly imagined. The courtroom reacted in the way American courtrooms react to sentences that feel both harsh and earned, with the conflicted silence of people who wanted justice and now have to live with what justice looks like. Diane's family did not celebrate. Margaret lowered her head. Rosa pressed the memorial booklet against her chest. Harold Kinney stared at his hands. There was no triumph, because triumph requires the undoing of loss, and loss is permanent. What they felt was closer to recognition, the recognition that the system had listened, weighed, and spoken. It was not healing. It was acknowledgement. Judge Trent's closing remarks would be quoted for years. This court does not sentence with anger, nor with satisfaction. It sentences with the awareness that Diane Holloway existed, that she mattered, and that her life was taken by someone who had every opportunity to choose differently. Accountability is not cruelty. It is the boundary that protects the living. He looked at Natalie one final time, and not with contempt, but with something harder to name. A sober awareness that he was looking at a 16-year-old who had made herself irreversible, and that the sentence he had imposed was the system's best attempt to hold both tragedy and consequence in the same hand. Natalie was escorted from the courtroom without incident. She did not look at the gallery. She did not look at the photographs of her mother. She walked with the mechanical steps of someone moving through a world that had finally become real. Behind her, the courtroom slowly emptied. People stood in the hallway, spoke in low voices, and gradually dispersed into a ridge haven that would never again confuse quiet with safe. The Holloway house was sold. The flower bed was replanted. Winslow Lane resumed its rhythms, school buses, mail trucks, porch lights at dusk. But the story lingered. It lingered in the question it left behind, the one that true crime audiences carry with them long after the screen goes dark. Was the sentence justice, or only the closest the law can come to it? And if Natalie Holloway emerges decades from now, older than Diane ever got to be, what would redemption even look like for a girl who killed her mother and smiled? The law answered with a number. The heart still searches. If you think the sentence fit the crime, or if you think no sentence ever could, share this story, because the conversation doesn't end with a gavel. It ends with us. The smirk didn't survive the sentence. And the table Diane set for two was never set again. In the weeks following the sentencing, the case became something larger than its facts. It entered the national conversation about juvenile justice, parental isolation, digital age dangers, and the invisible line between a troubled teenager and a dangerous one. Legal scholars debated Judge Trent's 35-year threshold, some arguing it was proportionate, others claiming it was excessive for a 16-year-old, and still others arguing it was lenient for someone who took a life with such calculation. The debate was not idle. It touched the foundational question every justice system must answer. When a child does something monstrous, do we punish the child or the monster? And can the two be separated? Natalie was transferred to a facility equipped for young adult offenders, a hybrid environment designed to bridge the gap between juvenile detention and adult prison. The facility offered education, counseling, and structured programming, resources that Natalie had never accessed in the outside world, resources that Diane had tried to arrange but never got the chance to implement. The irony was not lost on anyone involved in the case. The system was now providing what a mother had begged for, but only after the mother was gone. Natalie enrolled in classes. She attended mandated therapy sessions. Staff described her as compliant but guarded, participating in programs without appearing to internalize them. Whether compliance would eventually evolve into genuine change was a question that decades, not months, would answer. Tyler Brask's case resolved separately. His plea agreement resulted in a significant sentence for his role as an accessory, though shorter than Natalie's. His attorney framed him as an immature enabler, not a mastermind, and the court largely agreed, while making clear that enabling murder is not a minor offense. Tyler expressed what his attorney characterized as remorse, though prosecutors noted that his remorse seemed focused on his own situation rather than Diane's death. He would serve years in custody, carry a record for life, and join the growing archive of cases where digital communication turned bad influence into criminal liability. Rosa continued to tend Diane's memory with the quiet persistence that had defined their friendship. She visited the memorial garden on Winslow Lane monthly, pulling weeds, replacing flowers, and sitting on the bench the neighbors had installed. She didn't talk about the case publicly after the trial. She didn't write a book or start a podcast. She simply kept showing up, the way Diane had always shown up, reliably, without announcement, because that was what mattered. When asked once by a reporter how she remembered Diane, Rosa answered with a sentence that contained an entire life. She always set an extra place, just in case someone needed to sit down. The legal legacy of the case extended beyond sentencing. Judge Trent's ruling was cited in subsequent juvenile transfer hearings across multiple jurisdictions as an example of how courts could balance constitutional protections for minors with the demands of accountability in cases involving extreme premeditation. The phrase sustained deliberation, Trent's term for Maya's weeks-long planning, entered legal shorthand for distinguishing impulsive juvenile offenses from calculated ones. Defense attorneys both criticized and reluctantly acknowledged the framework, while prosecutors adopted it with precision. The case didn't change the law. It refined how the law was spoken. The Holloway home on Winslow Lane was purchased by a young couple who knew nothing of its history until a neighbor mentioned it casually during a barbecue. They considered selling but decided to stay, reasoning that a house is just walls and a roof and that what happened inside it belonged to the past. They repainted the bedroom. They replaced the kitchen table. They planted new flowers in the bed Diane had maintained. The street adjusted, the way communities always do, absorbing trauma into routine until the routine itself becomes the memorial. Children rode bikes past the house. The mailbox stood upright. The porch light came on at dusk. But for those closest to the case, the adjustment was slower and less certain. Margaret, Diane's sister, described the grief as seasonal, not constant, but returning with specific triggers. A song Diane liked, a recipe Diane made, the anniversary of the night, everything changed. She attended a support group for families of violent crime victims, where she found not answers, but company. People who understood the specific texture of grief that comes when the person who harmed your loved one is someone you also loved. "You grieve twice," Margaret said. "Once for who you lost, once for who took them." Natalie's psychological evaluations continued in custody, mandated by the terms of her sentence. Over months, then years, clinicians would track whether she developed the capacity for genuine empathy, whether the attachment wounds that shaped her early life could be addressed through sustained therapeutic work, and whether the person who emerged at 51, if parole was ever granted, bore any resemblance to the 16-year-old who smiled in a courtroom. The evaluations were not optimistic or pessimistic. They were clinical. And clinical means patient. The system would watch, document, and wait. The final image of the case, the one that stayed with anyone who followed it, was not a courtroom scene. It was the photograph Diane posted the night before she died, the kitchen table set for two. 2 plates, 2 glasses, 2 napkins folded with care, 1 chair occupied, 1 chair empty. Diane had captioned it, "The small things matter." She was right. They did matter. Every meal she prepared, every table she set, every moment she chose to keep trying was a small act of love aimed at someone who was already planning its opposite. At the table told the truth about Diane Holloway before the courtroom ever could. She never stopped showing up, even when no one sat down. The small things mattered. The table is proof. The Holloway case did not exist in a vacuum. It joined a growing catalog of cases that forced the American justice system to confront an uncomfortable reality: that children are capable of profound violence, and that the frameworks designed to handle juvenile offenders were built for a different kind of crime. shoplifting, vandalism, drug offenses, impulsive fights. These were the acts the juvenile system was engineered to address, with rehabilitation at its center and the assumption that young people can change. But cases like Natalie Holloway's strained that assumption to its limits because the crime was not impulsive, the concealment was not naive, and the defendant's post-crime behavior suggested a sophistication that made child feel like a technical designation rather than a moral reality. Advocacy groups responded with predictable passion on both sides. Juvenile justice reform organizations argued that the case was being used to justify a punitive overreaction, that one extreme case should not define policy for millions of young offenders, and that the science of adolescent brain development remained valid regardless of how disturbing the facts were. They pointed to data showing that juvenile offenders who receive treatment have lower recidivism rates than those sentenced to adult facilities. They argued that sentencing a 16-year-old to 35 years before parole eligibility was functionally similar to giving up on her, and that giving up on children is something a civilized society cannot afford. On the other side, victim advocacy groups and prosecutors' organizations argued that the juvenile system's emphasis on rehabilitation works precisely because most juvenile offenses are not like this one. When the crime involves sustained planning, domestic betrayal, and the permanent destruction of a family, the system's obligation shifts from rehabilitation to accountability and public safety. They argued that Diane Holloway's rights were as important as Natalie's, that the community's need for protection was not a form of vengeance, and that consequences proportionate to harm are the foundation of any functional legal order. The debate was not resolvable because both sides were partly right, and the law's job is to function in the space between competing truths. Judge Trent, in a rare post-sentencing interview given months later to a legal journal, reflected on the difficulty of the decision. He described the Holloway case as the most challenging of his career, not because the evidence was unclear, but because the emotional terrain was impossible to navigate without cost. You sit on that bench and you know that whatever number you say will define two things: a defendant's life and a community's faith in the system, he said. If the number is too low, the community feels betrayed. If the number is too high, you've abandoned the possibility that a child can become something better. My job is to find the line, and the honest truth is that the line doesn't exist as a clean, bright mark. It's a shadow. The case also prompted renewed attention to the systems that failed before the crime occurred. Diane had sought help from school counselors, from a family therapist, from her own research into parenting resources. Each of those touch points functioned as designed. The school flagged behavior. The counselor offered advice. The therapist provided sessions. But none of them connected. The school didn't know about the therapist. The therapist didn't know about the second phone. Nobody had the complete picture because the systems were not designed to share one. In hindsight, the warning signs were visible, in real time, and they were scattered across institutions that don't talk to each other. The case became an argument for integrated family risk assessment, a concept that sounds bureaucratic but might have meant in this case that someone with the full picture could have intervened before a plan became an act. Mental health professionals who commented on the case emphasized that Natalie's trajectory, escalating resentment, digital isolation, attachment disruption, influence by an older peer, was not unique. Variations of it exist in schools across the country, usually resolving in less catastrophic ways. A runaway attempt, a truancy spiral, a cry for help that someone recognizes. What made Natalie's case different was the convergence of factors: unaddressed psychological vulnerability, access to a validating external voice in Tyler, and the perception that her home was a prison and the absence of any intervention that arrived in time. The case was not proof that teenagers are monsters. It was proof that without adequate support, the distance between a struggling teenager and a dangerous one can be terrifyingly short. The conversation extended into digital spaces where the case was discussed, dissected, and debated by millions who had never set foot in Ridgehaven. Comment sections became forums for competing moral frameworks: punishment versus rehabilitation, justice versus mercy, the rights of victims versus the potential of offenders. The case became a mirror reflecting whatever values the viewer brought to it. For some, it was proof the system works. For others, proof it failed. For most, it was simply proof that the world contains situations where no answer feels complete, where justice is the best available option rather than a satisfying one. What remained constant beneath the debate was Diane, not as a symbol or a case study, but as a person who made lunches and set tables and tried to save someone who didn't want to be saved. The system could argue about itself. The community could process its trauma. The law could refine its language. But Diane Holloway would still be gone, and the flowers in the memorial garden would still need tending, and Rosa would still show up on the first Saturday of every month, pulling weeds in the quiet, because that was the kind of thing Diane would have done. The system was on trial. The system delivered its answer, and the answer, like all human answers, was imperfect and necessary. Our Tyler Brask's sentencing took place in a smaller courtroom with less media attention, which was itself a commentary on how the public allocates its outrage. Tyler was not the one who killed Diane Holloway. He never entered the house. He never touched the weapon. His crime was subtler and, in some ways, more insidious. He fed a fire that someone else lit, and when the fire consumed a life, he tried to walk away, as if the warmth on his face had been coincidental. The law does not treat such distance as innocence, and Tyler was about to learn what proximity to violence costs, even when your hands appear clean. His plea agreement had been negotiated in the shadow of Natalie's trial. By cooperating, Tyler avoided the worst charges, but he did not avoid consequences. His attorney, a public defender with a methodical style, argued that Tyler was himself a product of neglect, a dropout from a fractured home, a teenager who had never been taught empathy because no one had modeled it for him. The argument carried the same truth and the same limitation as Natalie's defense. Background explains behavior without excusing it. Tyler's upbringing was genuinely difficult. His encouragement of Natalie was genuinely harmful. Both could be true at once. The prosecution's sentencing memorandum for Tyler was shorter than Natalie's, but no less pointed. It described his role not as a mastermind, but as a force multiplier, someone who amplified Natalie's anger, validated her grievances, and provided a psychological safety net that made the crime feel possible. His messages were quoted: "No one can stop you but yourself. People who control you don't deserve loyalty." The prosecution argued that these words, in context, constituted encouragement of the most dangerous kind, the kind that sounds like empowerment while pointing toward destruction. Tyler's allocution was more articulate than Natalie's, which made it simultaneously more credible and more suspect. He expressed regret for not seeing where things were going and for not doing something to stop it. He said he thought about Diane and wished he had told someone. The words were correct. They hit the right notes. But the prosecutor's rebuttal was quiet and devastating. He texted, "Are you okay?" after receiving the message, "It's done." He didn't call police. He didn't call anyone. He asked if she was okay, not if her mother was. The distinction illuminated Tyler's moral failure with surgical precision. The judge sentenced Tyler to 12 years, with parole eligibility after 8, a sentence that reflected his lesser role while acknowledging the gravity of what his involvement had facilitated. Tyler's reaction was physical. His shoulders dropped, his head lowered, and he gripped the table's edge as if the floor had tilted. 12 years for a 17-year-old meant entering his 30s before freedom was even a possibility. His mother, seated in the gallery's back row, covered her face. There were no cameras to capture it, no national headlines. Tyler's reckoning was quieter than Natalie's, but the sound of years being assigned to a life is the same in every courtroom: heavy, irreversible, and final. And in custody, Tyler would follow a path parallel to Natalie's, but separate from it. Education programs, counseling, vocational training, the slow institutional machinery designed to return people to society with more than they entered. Whether Tyler would use those resources sincerely or strategically remained an open question. His history suggested adaptability. The same trait that made him dangerous as a free teenager might make him functional as an incarcerated one. But adaptability without empathy is just survival, and survival without moral growth is just time served. The case against Tyler also raised questions that extended beyond his individual conduct. How responsible is a person for the influence they exert through language? Where does free speech end and criminal encouragement begin? When a teenager tells another teenager to be free and the listener interprets freedom as violence, who bears the blame? These questions have no clean answers, which is why the law uses standards like reasonable person and foreseeable consequence, imperfect tools for measuring something as fluid as influence. Tyler's case landed in the legal gray area where intent is unclear but impact is catastrophic, and the system chose to err on the side of accountability. Tyler's defense attorney filed a notice of appeal, citing the sentence's length relative to Tyler's peripheral role. The appeal would wind through courts for months, perhaps years, generating additional legal commentary and consuming resources. But the appeal process, whatever its outcome, would not change the central fact. Tyler Brask used words to encourage a murder, and when the murder happened, he asked the killer if she was okay. The law gave that fact a number. Whether the number was right would be debated. That it was necessary would not. Somewhere in the system, Tyler and Natalie now existed in parallel confinement, separated by walls, connected by a crime, and facing futures that were defined not by what they had wanted, but by what they had done. The distance between them was physical. The weight they carried was shared. 2 teenagers, 2 sentences, 1 family erased, and a question that followed both of them into their cells. Was it worth it? The answer was already written in Diane's empty chair. 1 year after the sentencing, Ridgehaven had resumed its routines with the practiced normalcy of a community that has chosen to heal by continuing. School buses ran on time, lawns were mowed, and the library hosted its summer reading program. The surface looked unchanged, but surfaces are unreliable witnesses. Beneath the mowed lawns and waving neighbors, the Holloway case had left a mark that manifested in small, persistent ways. Parents who checked their children's phones more carefully, neighbors who looked twice at late-night lights, a school system that implemented new protocols for flagging students who showed signs of escalating distress. The changes were quiet. They were also real. The memorial garden on Winslow Lane had grown from a modest planting into something more substantial. Neighbors contributed plants, a local garden club donated labor, and the bench installed in Diane's memory bore a simple plaque. She always showed up. The phrase had become a shorthand in the community, a way of describing not just Diane, but the kind of person everyone wanted to be and feared they weren't. Rosa continued her monthly visits, though she now came with company. Other friends joined her, forming an unofficial rotation that ensured the garden was never untended. It was, in its way, the most accurate monument to Diane's character, maintained not by an institution, but by the people who loved her. Diane's sister Margaret established a scholarship fund in Diane's name, awarded annually to a single parent pursuing further education. The fund was small, a few $1,000s, sourced from community donations and a percentage of the Holloway estate. But its existence was a deliberate act of meaning-making, an attempt to ensure that Diane's story produced something generative, not just grief. The first recipient was a woman who worked 2 jobs and was completing a nursing degree. She sent Margaret a handwritten thank you note that Margaret kept in the same drawer where she kept Diane's last birthday card. Some drawers hold everything. The Ridgehaven School District, under pressure from parents and its own internal review, implemented a behavioral monitoring system that allowed counselors, teachers, and administrators to share observations about students of concern. The system was designed with privacy safeguards and was not intended as surveillance, but as a means of connecting dots that previously existed in isolation. A student flagged by one teacher for emotional withdrawal could now be seen in context alongside another teacher's observation of aggressive language and a counselor's note about family conflict. On whether the system would have caught Natalie in time was unknowable. But the question wasn't whether it would have caught Natalie. The question was whether it might catch the next one. The case's digital footprint, the news articles, the podcast episodes, the YouTube analyses, the social media debates continued to circulate long after the courtroom emptied, each retelling added interpretation, emphasis, and sometimes distortion. The story was simplified, expanded, mythologized, and argued over in ways that Diane herself would probably have found overwhelming. But the circulation served a purpose that extended beyond entertainment. It kept the conversation alive about juvenile violence, parental isolation, digital age dangers, and the systems that fail before they're even asked to work. Stories don't change laws by themselves, but they change the people who change laws. And Diane's story, in all its retellings, continued to reach people who recognized something in it: a mother's exhaustion, a child's anger, a community's blindness, and felt compelled to respond. Natalie, in custody, marked the anniversary of her mother's death with an act that staff found ambiguous. She requested a visit from Margaret. The request was processed, evaluated, and ultimately declined by Margaret, who said she was not ready and might never be. The refusal was not punitive. It was survival. Margaret couldn't look at her niece without seeing both the child she had loved and the person who had taken her sister. The two images could not coexist in the same room. Natalie was informed of the refusal without comment. Staff reported that she nodded, returned to her cell, and sat quietly for the rest of the day. Whether she felt grief, rejection, or strategy was unreadable. Perhaps it was all three. The one-year mark also brought renewed media interest, and with it, the inevitable question: has Natalie changed? The answer from those who had access was carefully non-committal. She attended programs. She completed coursework. She spoke in therapy sessions with what clinicians described as increasing verbal engagement. But engagement is not transformation, and transformation in cases of severe antisocial behavior is measured in decades, not months. The system would continue to evaluate her at mandated intervals. I'm building a longitudinal record that would eventually be presented to a parole board, a board that would have to determine whether the woman sitting before them bore any meaningful relationship to the girl who smiled in court. In the end, what remained was not the case, but the person at its center, not Natalie, but Diane. The woman who set the table for two, the woman who kept a notebook of counseling resources, the woman who texted back right away, the woman who went to therapy alone because her daughter wouldn't go, the woman who believed until the very end that love was a strategy that would eventually work. It didn't work, but it wasn't wrong, because love is not measured by its success. It is measured by its persistence. And Diane Holloway persisted until the night someone decided persistence was the problem. The garden grew, and the scholarship funded another year. The table was never set again, but the memory of the setting, 2 plates, 2 glasses, 2 napkins, 1 hope, remained. Years move differently inside a facility than they do on the outside. Outside, seasons change, and children grow, and neighborhoods evolve. Inside, time is measured in routines, meals, counts, programs, lights out. Natalie Holloway would spend decades inside that rhythm, aging from teenager to adult to middle-aged woman in a space designed to contain consequences. The question the case left behind, the one no sentence can answer, is whether containment can produce transformation or whether it simply produces compliance that looks like transformation from the outside. The philosophical divide is real. Our restorative justice advocates argue that punishment without redemption is cruelty with a legal name. Retributive justice advocates argue that some crimes are so severe that the offender's potential for change must be weighed against the victim's inability to change anything at all. Diane Holloway cannot grow. She cannot learn. She cannot forgive or refuse to forgive. She is permanently fixed in the state Natalie put her in. And any discussion of Natalie's future must contend with the fact that Diane doesn't have one. That asymmetry is the moral core of every sentencing debate, and no amount of legal sophistication has ever resolved it. Judge Trent's framework, 35 years before parole eligibility, was an attempt to hold both sides of the equation. It said, "You are young, and we acknowledge that. But you are also responsible for an irreversible act, and we acknowledge that too." The framework was neither optimistic nor pessimistic. It was structural. It created a container large enough for the possibility of change, while firm enough to honor the weight of loss. Whether it was the right answer depends on what you believe justice is for, a question that has occupied philosophers and legal scholars for millennia without producing consensus. Natalie's parole hearing, if it occurs, will be a reckoning of its own. A board will review decades of evaluations, program participation records, psychological assessments, and facility behavior reports. They will look for evidence of genuine empathy, not the performed kind that Natalie demonstrated at 16, but the earned kind that comes from years of confronting what you've done without the shield of denial. They will also listen to victim impact statements from surviving family members, some of whom may still carry the wound as freshly as they did the day it was inflicted. The hearing will not be a trial. It will be a question. Has this person become someone safe to return to the world? The broader question, what do we do with children who commit adult crimes? Will outlive this case and every case like it. It is a question that surfaces whenever the justice system encounters a defendant who is both perpetrator and child, both dangerous and developing, both responsible and incomplete. The law has tools for this: transfer hearings, blended sentences, parole review mechanisms, and constitutional limits on juvenile punishment. But tools are not answers. They are the means by which a society attempts to fashion answers in real time, case by case, with imperfect information and competing values. The Holloway case added to that ongoing conversation without concluding it. What can be said with certainty is that Diane Holloway deserved better. She deserved a daughter who responded to love with love, or at least with the willingness to receive it. She deserved a system that connected the warning signs before they became a plan. She deserved to wake up the morning after that last dinner, to drive to work, to text Rosa, to tend her flower bed, to set the table again. She deserved another ordinary day. She didn't get it. And the reason she didn't get it was not fate or bad luck or an act of nature. It was a choice made by someone she loved, in a house she maintained on a night she believed was safe. The case ended with a sentence. The story ended with a question. And the question, was it justice, is one that only the living can debate because the dead have already given their answer through absence. Diane's absence is the loudest voice in this entire story. It speaks in empty chairs and untended gardens and phone calls that will never be returned. It speaks in the scholarship checks that carry her name and the memorial bench where Rosa sits on Saturdays. It speaks in the silence of a courtroom after a gavel falls. If this story moved you, if it made you think about justice or mercy or the fragile distance between a home and a crime scene, then share it, not for views, not for engagement, but because stories like this deserve witnesses. Diane Holloway showed up every day. The least the rest of us can do is remember why. The table was set for two. It always will be. There is a house on Winslow Lane with new paint and new owners and a garden that blooms every spring. The people who live there now do not know that the kitchen once held a table set with 2 plates, 2 glasses, and more hope than any table should have to carry. They do not know that a mother once stood in that kitchen at 5 in the morning, packing a lunch for a daughter who was already gone in every way that mattered. They mow the lawn, they check the mail, they wave at neighbors. The house does what houses do. It holds the next family and keeps the last family's secrets in its walls. Rosa still comes to the garden on the first Saturday of each month. She pulls weeds, adjusts the flowers. Joanne sits on the bench with the plaque that reads, "She always showed up." Sometimes she talks to Diane, not out loud, but in the quiet internal conversation that grief invents when it cannot accept silence. She tells Diane about the weather, about work, about the scholarship recipient who sent a thank you card. She tells Diane she misses her. She tells her the garden is doing well. She doesn't mention Natalie. Some subjects are too heavy, even for the dead. Margaret sends a card to the detention facility every year on Diane's birthday. She doesn't address it to Natalie by name. She writes Holloway on the envelope and includes a single photograph of Diane, a different one each year, with no note attached. It is not forgiveness. It is not punishment. It is something in between, a reminder that the person Natalie took from the world had a face, a life, and a birthday that someone still marks on a calendar. Whether Natalie looks at the photos and what she feels when she does is unknown. The facility confirms delivery. The silence that follows belongs to Natalie alone. The scholarship fund grew modestly over the years, supported by community donations and an annual fundraiser organized by Diane's former co-workers. Each recipient was a single parent, someone juggling work and education and children, someone who might have recognized in Diane a version of their own life. The fund didn't change the world. It changed a few lives. And those few lives, in turn, changed a few more. That is how legacy works, when it is built not on fame, but on the small, insistent act of showing up. And Diane's legacy was never going to be a monument. It was always going to be a table set with care, an extra plate for whoever needed it, and the quiet belief that effort matters even when it doesn't save you. The courtroom where Natalie was sentenced has seen other cases since. Judge Trent continued to serve on the bench, carrying the Holloway decision with him as a reference point. Not a template, but a scar. He once told a colleague that every juvenile case since has been shaped in some way by the memory of a 16-year-old girl who smiled in court and a mother who never got to see justice delivered for her own death. The law moves forward. The people who administer it carry everything backward. Ridgehaven continues. The school district's behavioral monitoring system flagged 2 students in its first year. Neither case resulted in violence, both resulted in intervention. It is impossible to know if the system prevented something. Prevention, by definition, produces no evidence. But the absence of evidence is, in this context, the best possible outcome. The system worked because nothing happened, and nothing happened because someone, a teacher, a counselor, a parent, connected a dot that previously would have remained isolated. Diane would have understood the value of that. She spent her life connecting dots no one else noticed. Tyler Brask served his sentence and was released, re-entering a world that had largely forgotten his name. He moved to a different state, found employment, and disappeared into the anonymity that most people take for granted. Whether he carried the weight of his role in Diane's death or whether he had learned to set it down was a private matter between him and whatever version of conscience he possessed. The law was finished with him. Morality, perhaps, was not. And Natalie? Natalie remains. She is no longer 16. She is no longer the girl who smiled. She is becoming someone else. Or she is not. The evaluations continue. The therapy continues. The clock continues. And somewhere inside a facility that looks nothing like Winslow Lane, a woman who was once a girl sits in a room and faces the only audience that matters now, herself. The performance is over. The cameras are off. The jury has gone home. So what remains is the question that no courtroom can adjudicate and no sentence can resolve. Can a person who destroyed love ever learn what love was? Diane Holloway believed the answer was yes. She believed it every day she set that table. She believed it every night she left the porch light on. She believed it until the last moment of her life, asleep in a home she thought was safe, trusting a daughter she thought she could reach. She was wrong about the outcome. She was not wrong about the principle. Because the principle, that people are worth reaching for, even when they pull away, is the only principle that has ever built anything worth keeping. The porch light on Winslow Lane still comes on at dusk. Different hands flip the switch now. But the light is the same, and if you drive down that street at the right hour, in the right season, you might see it. A small, warm glow in a window that once meant someone was waiting, someone was hoping, someone believed that tonight might be the night everything got better. It wasn't, but she never stopped believing it could be. The table was set for two, the light stayed on, and the story, like all true stories, doesn't end. It just stops being told until someone remembers and tells it again. The smirk is gone. The light remains.